Hello there, Bob Coppage, crotchety old geek. This is Biz Tech Twists. Yay. So again, CEO Simplex-IT and author of 3 books. And what is particularly important for this episode, I am old. And what I want to talk about is that horrible of horrible things that happened to our industry way back when. No, I'm not talking about MySpace. I'm talking about Y2K. And what I want to do is I want to give a little bit of an explanation of the history behind Y2K and why it happened. And the reason being is because in a lot of cases, and I've seen this throughout my career, and I've been in the IT business now for over 40 years, because again, I'm old. Pay attention. In a lot of cases, we have to work with legacy technologies. We have to work with technologies that were created X number of years ago, and we're faced with supporting this, and we look at it and we go, why in God's name did they do it that way? And this is especially true, and this is a shout out to my manufacturing friends, of which I have none, friends that is. One of the things we've always talked about in manufacturing, especially when it comes to IT or technology, is the definition of obsolete in manufacturing is it doesn't turn on anymore. And the reason why I say that is because we have a lot of manufacturing clients, and seriously, they're great. But they may have a machine out there on the shop floor that works perfectly well, creates great product and value for the clients, and it does so effortlessly. It's fantastic, but it only works with a machine that is running Windows XP. I kid you not. And XP, for those of you who may remember or not, has not been supported by Microsoft for over a decade. So we go to the CEO of the manufacturing company and we say, hey, here's the good news, is we can replace that machine with a new one that runs under Windows 11, and it'll only cost you $100,000. And they'll look at me and basically tell me where to go, which makes sense because they've got a product that doesn't cost them $100,000 and does exactly what they need to do. Now, we find our ways around it by, isolating the machine, keeping it from the internet, blah, blah, blah. But my point is that someone may look at that software that was written that only runs on XP and say, why would someone write it like that? Well, you got to remember, when it was written running under the technology and running under the resources that was available, in this particular case, 25 years ago, a quarter of a century ago. So why am I bringing that up, and why am I bringing Y2K up? So I want to take you back to 1978. I was working in Hiram, Ohio, at a company called Ohio Scientific Instruments. I was actually also going to college at Hiram College, but to be honest, I was more involved with Ohio Scientific than Hiram. Hiram actually had Ohio Scientific Instruments, which was, I think, the 4th largest manufacturer of microcomputer-based devices. This was way before the PC. And actually, I think it was right around or right before the Apple II even came out. Now, these were computers that had no hard drive, no floppy drive. And I'm not saying that's because they weren't available for this product. They didn't exist that were, affordable or even mass produced enough to mean anything. Plus, there was no operating system. So these were machines that had basically, literally, a version of usually Microsoft Basic when you booted it up. So you had basic programming language, and you stored your programs on cassette tapes. Yes, ask your parents; they'll show you a cassette tape. And so you had to, every time you turned the machine off, when you turned it back on again, you'd have to load the program back into memory. And that would take about 5 minutes or so. And there was no storing of data unless you wanted to store it on the cassette tape, which was doable, but weird. And you had a total of 4K, that's K with a K, of programming memory using BASIC. And BASIC, there was no SQL, there was no database commands, there was no nothing. You used memory variables and you used memory. So every letter in your program took up a byte. Every number took up a number, a numeric. And so everything we did, we had to look very, very closely at how much memory we were using, how much resources we were using. And the reason we had to do that is because we were trying to get as much performance as we could. And performance was all about what it did for the end user. And so we literally were looking for, and I remember truly going through programs where I was trying to get 4 or 5 more bytes so I could do one more thing. And for those of us who remember the programming language BASIC, every program line had a line number. We used small line numbers. So we tried to stay away from 3-digit line numbers. Oh, God help us if we ever got to 4 digits. So what we ended up doing is we were playing with dates. Whenever we had a program that worked with dates, instead of saying, February 3rd, 1984, which would be 02/03/1984, hey, we had this great idea. Let's drop the 19, because who's ever going to do anything in the 21st century? So that's how we wrote the program.
Are you fed up with reactive IT providers who take too long to respond, let problems fester, and nickel and dime you for every little thing? Say goodbye to those frustrations by choosing Simplex-IT, home of Amazon's best-selling author and BizTech Twist host Bob Coppedge. As Northeast Ohio's friendly neighborhood MSP, Simplex-IT has been providing top-notch managed and co-managed IT services since 2007, supporting hundreds of clients locally and across the United States. With a managed service provider like Simplex-IT, you'll benefit from proactive maintenance, 24/7 monitoring, and streamlined technology that will help you grow your business. Visit simplex-it.com for more information and to start experiencing stress-free IT today.
So anybody who wrote any programs that had the restrictions of program memory would come up with shortcuts. And the shortcuts could be no more comments in the programs because those took up memory. Years later, you'd have people screaming, why didn't these people put comments in the programs? We didn't have space. They would come up with ways of recalculating the dates. So we could do date math without having to deal with the century. Because every time we did anything with a date, that saved us 2 bytes. And at that point in time, that meant something. Yeah, it was only 0.05%, I think, of memory, but you do that enough times, that's meaningful. And so we rewarded at that point programs that had less documentation, less things that were clear cut, and ways that use shortcuts to use less memory, including shortcuts that would prove to be our undoing 20 or 30 years later, because the same code would be reused. Why reinvent? And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that code that I wrote back in 1980 to do, horoscope or something on a 4K machine would then be part of a payroll system 20 years later, but the idea is the same. So you had programmers all over the place who were financially, fiscally motivated. They were motivated in terms of recognition, in terms of productivity measurements. They were rewarded to take these shortcuts and to do things in such a way that penalized the people down the road, and in ways that they didn't necessarily foresee happening. Because if you would have asked somebody, they would have said, no one's going to be reusing my code. I was just talking to somebody the other day who was talking about working with an ERP module for a relatively modern ERP program, and it was looking at the data. And he said, there's no question about it, this database was an original COBOL database because it had all of the naming conventions and all of the standards that COBOL would deal with, that anyone who used to program in COBOL on the mainframes would like. We reuse stuff because we're supposed to. Why reinvent the wheel? And especially when we were talking about financial programs, and especially when we're talking about financial programs for banks or for financial institutions who have gone through the vetting process for particular sets of code or programs or projects or the like, and don't want to go through that vetting process again. And again, we're talking about back in the 90s. So they would reuse code that was vetted appropriately back in the 80s, which meant the same flaws would happen when they showed up in the 21st century. So what happens? A completely new group of programmers runs into the problem. And these new programmers are not ready to go look at these codes because a lot of cases the code was old and no one has taken a look at it. If you ever want to see a weird version of Y2K, go watch the movie Space Cowboys. See what I'm talking about. But the challenge is that now we have to, and we're under a time crunch, now we have to re-engineer and do it appropriately. And the only people who actually understand this are the people who understand both the motivations and the processes that the old coders went through, and who understand the motivations and the processes that the new coders are going through, and who understand the technology that's driving both of them. Those are the only people who actually understand what was going on. Now, why am I bringing that up here? Well, I'm bringing it up for a couple of reasons. You're probably running a computer somewhere. You're running Windows, or you're running Linux, or you're running Mac. But those OSs are driven by code, a lot of which is old or reused. And you're probably going through a firewall that's using old code. You're going through wireless access points. You're going through hubs and switches and lions and tigers and the like. And a lot of those are probably using old code. And in some ways, those old codes present opportunities that are vulnerabilities. So now they're not so much performance issues, but they're vulnerability issues because nobody 10, 20 years ago considered the idea that bad guys would actually be financially incentivized in order to actually get through and compromise these systems. Because prior to malware being discovered, 10 years ago or invented 10 years ago, 90% of the hacks, 90% of the viruses were by people who would, what do we call them technically? Jerks, who just came up with ways to do damage, cause harm. But now it's a different story. So now we have the bad guys who are out there trying to figure out ways, and they know that aside from people, because people are the best way to break into things, but aside from people, the best ways are to look for older technologies and vulnerabilities that have not been visited. But the thing is, it's not the fault of the people who developed those things 10 years ago, 15 years ago. They weren't facing the same risks. They weren't facing the same challenges. And they also didn't have the same tools as we do today. Crazy world, huh? Anyway, what's your thoughts, especially if you're old? And don't tell me to get off your lawn. I'm on your lawn. Even now. Leave me some comments, share, like. Catch you later. Bob Coppedge, BizTech Twists.